Welcome to The Catalyst. Today I want to discuss the story of Majid Kahn. Kahn is a 42-year-old Saudi-born Pakistani national who left the surface of the earth in 2003 when he was detained in Pakistan and then handed over to American authorities who placed him in an undisclosed CIA black site for 3 years. Now, last week, Kahn became the first high-value detainee to have ever obtained their freedom. When he emerged in 2006, he was then placed in the U.S. detention facility in Cuba, known as Gitmo. This is in Guantanamo Bay. The Bush administration did not allow him legal counsel because, as CNN reported in 2006, he would reveal details of the interrogation techniques that were employed against him. They said, quote, "Information obtained through the program has provided the United States with one of the most useful tools in combating terrorist threats to the national security." Kahn has repeatedly claimed that he was tortured, and this was corroborated by official U.S. sources who state that these secret techniques were indeed used against him. He finally received his day in court in October of 2021, where he offered details of the kind of conditions he was subjected to. The details are not savory. He claimed that he was waterboarded in pools of ice-cold water repeatedly. When he went on hunger strikes, his food was inserted rectally. At one point, he chewed through an artery in his arm in an attempt to take his own life. He was sentenced to 10 years and was credited for the 15 years that he spent at Gitmo. His release has been delayed because until now, no country has been willing to accept him onto their soil. But last week, the country of Belize has come forward and opened their borders to him. What exactly did he do? According to official sources, namely a communique between the commander of Gitmo and the U.S. Southern Command, written in 2008, his crime was that he became interested in Al-Qaeda after 9/11 and knew that he was being vetted by the organization. He agreed to participate in assassination plot of then-president of Pakistan, Pervez Musharraf, but no attempt actually took place. U.S. authorities claim that he acted as a courier for money, $50,000, that were used in a Al-Qaeda bombing of a Marriott hotel in Jakarta in 2003. But our authorities admit that he may not have known what the money was going to be used for. Moreover, this raises bigger questions that I would like to discuss. These allegations have come from confessions that he made while tortured and through testimony that were given by other Al-Qaeda operatives. How can we possibly validate such confessions as even remotely accurate? And more importantly, what is the outcome of such practices? Are secret CIA black sites and torture making us safer? Or are they sowing the seeds for anti-American sentiment and terrorist activities?
For sure, Madhava. And, the issue of torture reminds me of what the late John McCain famously said, who was subjected to torture himself as a prisoner of war. He says these kind of torture tactics, said something akin to, will not reveal the truth from the detainee. They'll tell you what they think you want to hear so you'll stop torturing them. And I think that rings true. We've seen this happen in a number of cases, and under the direction of the Bush administration, these enhanced investigation tactics that they called, which is essentially torture, did not reveal the truth of the matter of what they wanted or what they were purporting to get from the detainee. But Khan, in this instance, was likely telling them whatever he thought they wanted to hear so he would stop being tortured. And this underscores, I think, the larger issue with the Bush administration when they engaged in what's called extraordinary rendition. Now, extraordinary rendition is the process of kidnapping a foreign citizen and delivering them to a third-party jurisdiction. But you could also kidnap somebody in the United States and do the same thing. And these sites are all around the world. Cuba, as Madhava mentioned, Romania, Thailand. This is something that the Bush administration did fairly readily. There are hundreds of people who are subjected to this. And these renditions were accomplished outside of treaties and the courts. So the Bush administration solely relied on presidential fiat, claims of executive privilege as the president to be able to do this in the national interest of the national security of the United States. But what's interesting to note is those claims clash heavily with longstanding jurisprudence and constitutional principles of the United States. The Supreme Court, for example, has repeatedly stated that the Due Process Clause applies to all persons within the United States, including non-citizens. So here, Kahn was a resident of Maryland, but even if he was a non-citizen, he should be afforded the same rights of due process, Madhava, that you and I are, and Joe, you as a Canadian citizen would be afforded. And listen, it's important to note that this wasn't just one Supreme Court decision where this was outlined. For more than a century, the Supreme Court has recognized that the Equal Protection Clause is universal in its application to all persons within the territorial jurisdiction of the United States, without regard to differences of nationality. And even if you go back to the founding fathers, James Madison, for example, he himself argued that those subject to the obligations of our legal system ought to be entitled to its protections. And his logic was based on the principles of due process, but also the inalienable natural rights enshrined in our Bill of Rights. So when you look at a case like this, it's interesting to observe how quickly the Bush administration was abandoning all of these longstanding principles of due process, constitutionality, just because they wanted to claim that the United States was under threat from international terrorism. And, listen, it's instructive because when we look at the Patriot Act, when we look at extraordinary rendition in the aftermath of 9/11, they're all being enacted based upon a proposed threat to everybody in the United States. So they're telling us you need to suspend your basic principles of constitutionality because you're in danger, right? And we have to really think about how flimsy our principles are if we're going to suspend them anytime the government says we have a national security threat. So therefore, the Bill of Rights no longer applies or due process no longer applies. And we should really explore what that means.
Yeah, and I think the concept of do these whether it's torture, whether it's the way sometimes the U.S. will enact its will on other countries under the guise of terrorism or under the guise of these apparent threats. What I find interesting about that, and as it relates to this case too, which is the throwing away of basic human rights. As a non U.S. citizen, looking at the U.S. and kind of the culture of patriotism and the culture of we live in the best country in the world, and the Constitution is the best thing that has ever been written, and but you look at the culture of the country and some of the things that happen, especially from a leadership level, and it's like, but this doesn't really seem to be true. Like the actions that are often taken upon people like Majid, or the actions of going and killing hundreds of thousands of citizens in countries because of an apparent threat, especially when those details are kind of flimsy, it doesn't feel like it's a country that's operating from the best ethics and values. And I find that as a general culture, I mean, there is definitely pushback in the United States when you look at it as an outsider from groups of people that want to stop war, but there's also a huge celebration of the policing that happens around the world, and it just seems like to some extent, if these actions are going to be taken, it's like, can you really be shocked as a country when so many people are going to be pissed off or want to be pushing back or wanting to be almost attacking back in ways? Because it's like you're creating that hatred and radicalization in a lot of cases under the guise of something that may not even be exactly what is taking place.
Yeah. Well said, both of you. I think, we get lost in how beautiful a document the Constitution is and the Bill of Rights. But the problem is, what is the point of such statements if it's being selectively applied to certain human beings and not others? These are the kinds of things that need to be stated for all human beings on this planet. And when you start choosing who gets to enjoy the rights that are spelled out, that's where you seed, honestly, you're sowing seeds of distrust and, a need to fight back against a country that would do that. And, that is primarily why I find this story so disturbing, is that is this kind of act and these kinds of measures, are they protecting us really? Why, like anyone who would who doesn't buy into this American exceptionalism would probably be aghast at what was happening. And for me it seems clear that the CIA, just the fact that they have black sites in all of these countries, that they don't do it in the on our soil makes it okay. I mean, that is so unbelievably hypocritical, and it disgusts me.
Even as a practical matter, right? I mean, how many enemies are you creating when you're torturing and you're basically suspending any sense of constitutionality? You know, the United States, a lot of people like to think we're the shining hill, right? We're the shining beacon of light on the shining hill, and that the world looks up to our principles and the fact that we're a country of laws. But when we suspend all of that and we think we're actually protecting our people, I would argue that we're endangering our people even further,
Yeah.
Yeah.
because we're essentially playing the game of the lowest common denominator. If there are barbaric acts that occur around the world, we're going to do the same thing. And
Yeah.
if people are being tortured, we're going to torture as well. But
Hmm.
that means you're essentially lowering the bar and you're suspending everything that the founders thought was important. And again, the reason why due process is so important is because for centuries, right, people were charged with crimes and they had no due process. And a monarch just said, hey, you're guilty of this, so we're going to throw you in prison for 20 years. And similar here, Khan, even though he admits that he did something wrong, right, he concedes that. I think he says, I deeply regret the things I did many years ago, and I've taken responsibility. But the point here is, if he committed these crimes, you don't just throw him in a CIA black site for 15 years. You bring him before a court and you try the case on the merits and the evidence. So, and if you have a strong enough case, he's going to be convicted. So it's, to me, this symbolizes something is amiss here, that it's obviously about something beyond just protecting the American people. This is about something probably far more sinister that we need to investigate.
Yeah, I want to say two things there. Obviously the black site was only 3 years, not 15, but in our courts, and David, you can speak to this more, but like there's some evidence is not discoverable, right? In other words, you can't present in court for whatever reasons. Like yet the testimony that was extracted from a water board, that somehow is discoverable now.
Mhm.
And what you said is absolutely true. Like we're creating hatred towards our country, but like, what is the next? What happens next? Well, now we have more dangers out there, so we continue with this sort of approach. This is it's a snowballing effect. We're just
Yeah.
causing more and more hatred towards the country, more terrorists, and that is going to be used to justify the ongoing elimination of due process here. And we need to stop this right now before it gets worse, if it possibly could.
And I think a lot of the leaders of countries and military, personnel, I don't think they have elementary minds where they can't see what you just pointed out about how this leads to more and more snowballing of violence, and then when you look at the military industrial complex and what that's all about and what that's building, you start to wonder, hey, are these actions being taken because of the end result of what the military industrial complex and geopolitical gains are had, in that whole story?
Absolutely, Joe. And to your point, even senior officials and senior officers of a military jury responsible for sentencing Khan condemned the torture by the CIA and said this is a stain on the moral fiber of America,
Hmm.
and characterized Khan's treatment as a shame for the U.S. government. So these are military officers saying this, not just advocates of human rights. So that, I mean, is an inside window into just how egregious our actions were in terms of detaining and torturing Khan.